Well, hello and welcome to today's edition of the Daily Objective. And today we have a very special edition. Professor Brian Simpson joins us. He's the author of a new book on reforming the Constitution. He is an expert in matters economic and business, and he has very definite opinions on how our system in the United States can be changed. So welcome, Professor Simpson.
Hello, James. Nice to be on your show.
Well, great to have you here. The truth is that our constitutional order has dramatically changed over the last century or so. And you have very specific proposals on how to get America back on track toward being a free market country, a place that respects economic liberties and property rights as it once did. I wonder if you could go through what you think are some of the most important reforms that you adumbrate there.
Right. Yeah. So one of the more important reforms is protecting the freedom of production and trade, and that's one of the changes that Ayn Rand explicitly stated in Atlas Shrugged, toward the end of Atlas Shrugged. Judge Narragansett. So protecting the freedom of production and trade explicitly, I think, is extremely important. If we had that in the Constitution as it is right now, I think we'd be much better off. But something I focus on as well is protecting the freedom to not trade with others as well. We have all kinds of anti-discrimination laws that basically force people to trade with others. Bakers being forced to bake cakes for weddings between same-sex couples and things like that. And so I think that it's extremely important to protect that right to not trade with others as well. And I think also protecting the individual rights by eliminating the ability of the government to regulate the economy. And so one change I make is eliminating the Commerce Clause. Now, some people might, even some objectivists, think that's controversial because the original intent of the Commerce Clause was to prevent the states from restricting trade between each other.
That's exactly right. For the first several decades, before the Civil War, for the entire first period of our constitutional history, the Commerce Clause was not used to justify any new federal legislation. It was used to strike down state laws that interfered with trade between the states. The original intent of the framers in that section, that's why they included the word interstate. And for a long time, even throughout the 19th century, it was thought that, ferries and trains and stuff going actually carried between states, and the act of being carried was all that the government could regulate. But that in the 20th century has completely been lost. But you're absolutely right. It was initially a limit on state power, taking that power away from the states to create a free trade zone in the United States.
Right. And that was a great intent, and I think appropriate to do, but it hasn't been used that way, especially since some of the New Deal cases. The Commerce Clause has been used to regulate to a much greater extent, to enable the federal government to do that. And so eliminating the Commerce Clause, I think, is necessary to protecting rights, but not just eliminating it, because we don't want the states to think that they can engage in restrictions as well of trade between the states. And so there are changes I make, or I suggest to the Constitution, that limit all levels of government, federal, state, and local, from violating rights and restricting trade. And I think if you eliminate the Commerce Clause and sort of strengthen the Constitution's overall purpose of protecting rights, which of course is the only proper purpose of government, then I think you'll have, and also protecting the freedom of production and trade explicitly, since that routinely violated. I think that would strengthen it and make it really fully consistent with the protection of individual rights.
What an excellent point. Article 4 of the body of the Constitution does put certain limits on states, and maybe the Commerce Clause should have been in the limitations on the states, not in the powers granted to the federal government at all. And then in combination with, say, an amendment that would protect voluntary production and trade, then you'd eliminate all government ability to interfere with the free market. That's a brilliant idea. I'm totally on all fours with you there.
Of course, Ayn Rand came up with the idea of an amendment protecting the freedom of production and trade,
Right.
but looking at the violations of the right to not trade, I think you really need something like that. And I also propose in the First Amendment protecting the freedom to not associate with others. So the freedom of association, I think, needs to be explicitly protected. It's implicitly protected in the First Amendment, but you know. Yeah, that's true. And really, though, to protect rights, you need to make things as explicit as possible. And that
Yes.
that prevents misinterpretation. And it also prevents, I think, or it protects in a stronger fashion if a country moves philosophically in the wrong direction, like we have been doing, for the last couple of hundred years since the founding, really, but especially the last 100 years, I'd say, or so. If you have things explicitly stated so that rights are explicitly protected, I think it provides more protection if there's philosophical movement in the wrong direction, the culture moves in the wrong direction. Now, if the culture gets bad enough, obviously, the protection of rights would just be completely abandoned. But I think there's a huge area there where it can move. I mean, even if we were philosophically sound, it could move in the wrong direction because promoting the right ideas, disseminating them from one generation to the next, that requires free will and people embracing the right ideas and passing those on, teaching those to the next generation. So it's possible to move in the wrong direction, and the maximum protection of rights, I think, can be created by explicitly naming these rights and protecting them.
Well, yeah, one of the great ironies, of course, is that the framers wanted the rights to be the freedoms of the people, the rights of individuals to be interpreted in a broad and open-ended way. Look at the Ninth Amendment. Look at their broad language. Right, liberty, and property, privileges. They use big, broad language. But when it comes to the powers, the 10th Amendment says, read those narrowly. So the powers and the procedures for the use of those powers should be read narrowly. So in effect, both the left and the right have taken each side that the framers feared, right? One side says, you can read the rights narrowly, ignoring the Ninth Amendment. The other side says, well, no, the government has these unlimited powers. Let's ignore the 10th Amendment and read out, strike out the word interstate from the Interstate Commerce Clause, for example. And so we're just, no language in a constitution can protect a culture that is in decay. And on the other side of that, do you think that we're currently in a cultural context where this is a viable, your proposals are viable? Ayn Rand and Dr. Peikoff were asked, would you favor a constitutional convention or constitutional reforms at this time? And they said, no, our culture is, if we had a constitutional convention today, it could create a nightmare upside down America. So your proposals, do you think America's ready for them? And if not, how do we get America ready for them?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would agree with Dr. Peikoff and Ayn Rand there. Yeah, we're not, it wouldn't be a good outcome if we had a constitutional convention at this point. We'd end up with the exact opposite results of what we want. We'd move further toward violating rights to a greater extent. So given the current philosophical and political climate, the main intention of the book is not to revise the Constitution and even the Declaration. I talk about some changes that could be made there, and that's not just academic, because I think the Declaration is a part of the law. Obviously, I wouldn't expect government to make a declaration of independence. We've already got that, but I think if we get to a point where we're philosophically much better off, governments at all levels, federal, state, and local, should make declarations to protect rights, again, to reaffirm or perhaps in some cases affirm affirm protecting rights. But given the philosophical climate, no, I don't think these would be implemented now, and I don't think we should have a constitutional convention. The main purpose, though, of the book in writing it and revising these documents is an educational endeavor. And I think that is what this book can help to do, help teach people what rights are, why they're important, and why they need to be protected, and what some specific changes are that could help protect rights in a consistent fashion. So, and that's extremely important. We, we need to, the culture has to change philosophically, obviously at the most fundamental levels, metaphysics and epistemology and ethics. So, these kinds of changes are political, but I even discuss the moral, the epistemological, and the metaphysical basis of rights in the first chapter of this book. So I discuss in detail.
Sort of where the Declaration messed up too. It regarded something so derivative as political rights as self-evident. I know the first draft was different and didn't say it in that term. Ben Franklin had different language, but they settled on language that seems to me philosophically misguided.
Right.
That in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one change I actually suggest, changing self-evident to undeniable, which I think is closer to what...
Exactly. It was closer to Franklin's original language.
Right, right.
Another thing is that I was a student of the late Professor Bernard Segan, who's pathbreaking. I regard some of his books as pathbreaking. Economic Liberties in the Constitution, the Supreme Court's Constitution. He argues that when the 14th Amendment was passed in the wake of the Civil War, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and he goes back to the debates of the framers of the 14th Amendment in Congress. And it is clear that the 14th Amendment was intended, obviously we wanted to protect the rights of freed Black slaves in the South, but the language was far broader than that, protecting the equal protection of rights against the states. And they say all persons, they use the word person, as opposed to someone of a race or someone of a sex or someone of a religion. It's all persons get equal protection. Professor Segan argued, though, that the Privileges and Immunities Clause was intended to protect the right to travel, the right to associate or not associate. That's what the congressman writing the law said. The right to open a business, the right to employ and be employed, the right to engage in contracts for adults, the right to travel and move about. And they even left it open. And all the other natural, to marry and have kids, to be sued, and all these other rights that were meant to be incorporated, including the protection of property rights and basic economic liberties. But the Supreme Court, just as they gutted equal protection with Plessy versus Ferguson, separate versus equal, so they, right out of the chute, completely gutted the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And in the course of the next history, they had to go through the Due Process Clause to enforce the Bill of Rights against the states. What a clunky, cumbersome way to have to go about it, when your proposals would, it seems to me, just straighten that out completely and would revolutionize things and get them back to what the framers of our original Constitution and the 14th Amendment more had in mind.
Right. Yeah, I think implicitly it's all there. The problem is, when it's only implicit, it's much easier to interpret things in a way that leads to violations of rights. So a lot of what I do is just make it explicit in terms of protecting property rights, the right to associate and not to associate, the freedom of production and trade, protect that, the right to not trade with others. So making those things explicit, I think, can only strengthen. And there's
necessary. As it turns out, it's necessary. History has shown.
It can't ultimately stop, like you say, the decay, the philosophical decay and decline of a culture. But I think with much more explicit protection, I think it can help in protecting rights to a greater extent, even with some philosophical decline, because people can point to a specific clause in the Constitution and say, hey, look, this explicitly states that I have the right to trade and to not trade with others. So, it's harder to evade the actual meaning in that case.
At this point, I have two requests. One from you, Professor Simpson. What is the full title of your book, and where can interested readers buy it?
Okay. Yeah, the main title is A Declaration and Constitution for a Free Society. And the subtitle is Making the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution Fully Consistent with the Protection of Individual Rights. It was published by Lexington Books, which is an imprint of the Rowman and Littlefield Publishing Group. It was published in their Capitalist Thought series, so there are a number of other books that are on economics and other topics and even some by objectivists, I believe, that are within that series. So you can get it through Lexington Books website, but it's available on Amazon and other website type booksellers. So you should be able to get it anywhere.
So my next request would be to our producer Daniel here. I wonder if you could include a link to Amazon and Barnes and Noble and the title of the book, so that interested listeners can click right to it.
And I can let's see if I can get this. Well, it's not appearing, but there it is. I guess
there seems to be a sweet spot in there.
It's not detecting the book, but there it is, right there. It's backwards too. I forgot that. It's a mirror image. At least you can see that there is a book, in fact.
Right. I wonder if we could go on to say another topic. Just this week, because of all the shootings that have been horrific shootings that have been going on in the United States over the last couple of weeks, especially the one in Texas and the one in Buffalo, New York, as well as some others. There's been a call to have radical gun control, sweeping gun control. And I heard more than one member of Congress, more than one representative in the House say, if the Supreme Court attempts to limit this, we need to end the filibuster. We need to pack the Supreme Court. We need to get people on that will alter the Supreme Court's position on a specific political issue. In my mind, that is a direct threat to an independent judiciary, the reduction of the courts to a mere arm of Congress's whims, and exactly a violation of one of the most fundamental things that James Madison built into our Constitution, the separation of powers. And when America did this revolutionary Constitution that separated powers explicitly, the whole idea of an independent judiciary became a fundamental notion in international law. To have a truly free society with an effective representative democracy, and not just some fake one, you can't have censorship, and you've got to have an independent judiciary to protect basic rights. I wonder what your thoughts are on recent calls by Democrats to end the filibuster, pack the Supreme Court, and over specific issues.
Yeah. I mean, just because they're not happy because they're not getting what they want, and it's only going to lead to greater violations of rights. I mean, that's what the Democrats want to do. So, ending the filibuster, packing the Supreme Court with any number of added justices. I mean, it's only going to make things worse from the standpoint of protecting rights. So it's not a good thing. I mean, these shootings, and that's one thing I do focus on in the book, strengthening the right to keep and bear arms. Even in the face of these shootings, I think we need that, because there's a lot of research.
More important.
Yeah, for law-abiding citizens, especially if they choose to protect themselves by owning a gun. And research shows that when they're, in fact, there's a book, I don't know if you've ever read that, the book called More Guns, Less Crime by John R. Locke Jr. I mean, that is an amazing book. He's gone through 3 editions. I don't know if he's out with a 4th edition already, but each edition.
An excellent book, yeah.
Yeah, and he shows clearly that when more law-abiding citizens are able to own guns, right to carry laws or concealed carry laws are passed, all kinds of violent crime decreases, including mass shootings. He even shows data on that. So
the presence of guards or even trained and armed teachers might prevent these things. So more guns might be the solution rather than fewer guns. And as a DA, for 18 years I was a public prosecutor in San Diego County, and boy, can I confirm the fact that in my experience, far more crimes are prevented by people possessing guns and saying this house is protected by a gun, or this business is protected by a gun, or some criminal being thwarted simply by the threat of a gun where no shooting is necessary.
Right, it's amazing.
A huge amount of crime is prevented that goes completely undetected. And when they say things like, shootings kill so many young people, they include suicides, they include inner city crime,
Between gang members and things like that.
Members and other gang members, and all that's excluded. And what we focus on are these shootings. And when you look at the actual numbers, say the homicide rate over the summer in Chicago dwarfs the numbers of these shootings, right? So,
right. Well, and John Lott shows that there doesn't seem to even be a link between right to carry laws and the number of suicides. But he also showed that women and minorities stand to benefit the most from reduced crime against them when right to carry laws are protected.
Absolutely. The vulnerable are the ones who are most at risk. And it's these politicians, of course, who all have armed security guards or Secret Service protection, and they're loaded with 9mm or worse at protecting them. Right.
And he shows data in other countries like the UK and other places where it's the same result. When, for instance, the UK banned handguns completely in the late 90s, and there was a huge spike in gun crimes and
gun crime. There were these amazing periods where after the complete ban, gun crime went up in England. Really astonishing.
Yeah. So,
and of course, people can do horrible things with cars. And slaughter 19 people with cars too. And we've seen situations like that. It's not as though guns have but they're magical. It's this thing. And it's obviously cultural too. We had a high per capita gun ownership rate long ago, and we didn't have any of these mass shootings.
Right. Exactly.
Do we have any super chat questions, Daniel?
No super chat questions yet, but I'd like to thank Bonnie, Mary-Ellen, and Mary-Ellen again for her super chat. And she was the one who asked for the Dr. Simpson's book. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary-Ellen. Thank you, Bonnie. We appreciate that. That stuff keeps the lights on around here. And if you do enjoy this kind of programming, please do consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. We're doing very exciting work, as you can see here. And if this is the kind of content that you like, hit subscribe, and then hit that join button for a modest monthly fee. You'll get all kinds of extra perks as well, and you'll help this programming keep going. So I wanted to get that out in. Is there anything, Professor Simpson, that apart from these sorts of things that you think should be in the Constitution procedurally that might protect us? Or is it just simply the substantive rights that you talk about?
It's largely the substantive rights. One thing that I don't know if you'd consider it a process, it is kind of a process, but limiting the right to counsel in the Sixth Amendment, I think, is important. So limiting it to what is necessary, the minimum basically to achieve justice, because I think that's going too far. I've read articles and heard a push, and maybe not a broad push at this point, but a push or a desire to have a right to counsel in civil trials as well. And I don't think, that's really going to protect rights. That's more of people need a lawyer in a divorce case or some sort of civil trial. And so the taxpayer should be forced to provide that. And that's more of a personal matter. It helps to protect rights often, these civil trials, but it's not, I think, the fundamental rights that need to be protected in the Constitution. So we need to limit that.
That's one. Because, in civil cases, the American system, if anything, has a very liberal and generous. If anything, we have lots of lawsuits that are encouraged already under our system, often frivolous ones. And we have a system wherein if you've got a decent case, a lawyer will tend to take it on contingency. He won't win unless there's some kind
Right.
of win on our part, and he'll take a percentage of it that you have to give him. So
Yeah,
if
that's
they're willing to take it on contingency, right? Sometimes class action suits are themselves funded by the government, and I'm very much opposed to that.
right,
So
right.
the last thing we need is
It's
giving everyone the right to get a lawyer so they can just go
yeah,
sue crazy anymore. Now, but even in criminal cases, the Supreme Court has said that at the taxpayer dime, everyone charged with a crime who can't afford it has a right to an attorney. You oppose that? I do.
well, well, I've heard different arguments about this,
Right.
and I don't oppose it because I think you need some minimum to achieve justice. I mean, it seems like that, the innocent people who are on trial who really can't afford an attorney could be basically ran over by the prosecution, because if they're there by themselves facing all the different laws and the procedures they don't know about, there needs to be some minimum, I think, in that situation. And that's I think a part, it's a part of providing police protection. I think you provide that even if people can't afford it, and I think at least some minimum amount of legal help is needed in order to achieve the correct results. Make sure we're prosecuting the right people and convicting the right people.
And put the state to the test. Make sure the state isn't just putting people in jail that they don't want, to be out there for political reasons or other reasons, or
Right.
It's not as though America has a perfectly clean history and apolitical prosecution.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I've heard different objectivists have very strong opinions both ways on the right to counsel.
Well, Dr. Peikoff makes a really good point. It's one thing to assign someone a lawyer, but if a lawyer doesn't want to take the case, and we have in most of our jurisdictions public defender offices,
Right.
both at the federal and state level, and if they're assigned the case, they've got to take it. And even if you are abhorred at taking a serial child molester's case and he's guilty, or some murderer rapist case and he's guilty, should a lawyer be compelled to take that case? On that side, I have to say Peikoff makes a great argument. If you can't get a lawyer to defend you, then you've got a real situation. But I agree with you. If you're truly indigent and the system isn't being exploited, then I think court-appointed attorneys are the way to achieve justice and keep the state on its toes.
Right, and holding your nose in some cases where, I mean, you have to at least make sure the due process is achieved. And I think a public defender, some type of lawyer like that's appointed, can provide that. Even if you think the person is guilty, that you want to see the appropriate process take place to achieve justice ultimately.
Absolutely. It really should be. There are a dozen other areas we could get into. There's a distinction the Supreme Court has drawn in free speech, completely artificial, completely recent, between commercial speech and political or religious or philosophical speech. If you're ideological, well, that's a fundamental right, and you have to meet strict scrutiny, and this government really can't interfere, and certainly no prior restraint of a political or philosophical or religious assertion. Now, when it comes to commercial speech, when it comes to advertisements, when it comes to public statements by corporations, that's entirely different. The government can regulate that. There can be prior restrictions on that. There can be all kinds of onerous restrictions on that. What do you think of that kind of distinction between so-called commercial speech and political or philosophical speech?
Yeah, I in the Constitution, my revised Constitution, I strengthen the right to free speech of corporations or people coming together and associating and creating a corporation. I think we need to protect the rights of individuals through the corporation and commercial speech to a much greater extent. Yeah, so I completely disagree with that separation of protecting the right to free speech for individuals, religious organizations, and religious speech, but not for corporations. We need that right needs to be protected as well, or strengthened. That protection.
And business people are the bad guys. I mean, it's like there's a presumption going in the door in many legal cases. There's this notion, for example, of unequal bargaining power. So sure, if you and I were to have a negotiation and a contract, the courts would be strict about interpreting the provisions of it. But if it's IBM versus a guy who's just buying, a single guy who's buying a computer, well, the
Right.
courts have said, again, in recent decades, there's this unequal bargaining power, and therefore even a voluntary contract can be, invalid because of this,
Right.
this so-called unequal bargaining power. What do you think of that?
Certainly, that interpretation has to go. I mean, yeah, it doesn't matter the economic power, what the differential is between two trading partners. They have the right to trade and to not trade, and the right to trade and not trade means being able to set the terms. And if you have more economic power, if I'm trading with say Microsoft or somebody like that, they have a lot more power, economic power than I do, but they have every right to set the terms of the trade that they want as I do, and I'm always free to walk away from the trade if I don't like the terms. But they shouldn't be forced to provide certain provisions to me just because I don't have the wealth that Microsoft has. No, we have to protect rights equally. I mean, if rights aren't protected, if everybody's not equal under law, including individuals through corporations, then rights aren't protected. It's
So you believe corporations should have the same equal protection right that persons do?
Well, corporations should have their rights protected, but it's ultimately protecting the rights of individuals
to associate,
to form a corporation and then interact and trade with individuals through that means. So it ultimately comes down to individual rights.
Civil liability, in large part, in my view, at least in major part, has been the result of this unequal bargaining power thing, so that in contracts, they can't have liability waivers or limitations on liability. If I buy a lawnmower at Walmart, Walmart can't say, well, this is an experimental lawnmower, it may be dangerous, and so you waive your liability to sue them for, and no. Strict liability has to apply, whatever the voluntary waiver. The price is cheaper because I'm signing this waiver.
Right.
Or if I want, I can buy a warranty or insurance on top of that. Now, if you want to, if the seller wants to sell me a warranty on my car, my lawnmower, or something, I should be able to negotiate that and the insurance for that. But the Supreme Court has said, no, strict liability applies to everybody because there's this unequal bargaining power, and therefore waivers of liability or limits on liability can't be built into your contracts with individual consumers. And that has set loose, it seems to me, just a huge proliferation of civil cases that really are invalid on their face, as far as I can see.
Right.
You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, as long as there's not some sort of fraud involved, I don't see why we're setting different standards basically for larger economic actors and smaller ones. I mean, that I think a lot of is what's behind a lot of other regulation in terms of like the existence of the FDA, for that matter. Right. Because there's a lot of risk and there is danger using drugs that might not be fully tested, but through your doctor and through pharmaceutical companies who certainly don't want to harm people. They don't want to harm and kill their customers because you're not going to last that long. And if it is fraudulent, you're going to end up with lots of lawsuits. So I think in order to we could have far more drugs. I think we would have had the COVID vaccine much earlier if we didn't have such.
And isn't it interesting? And isn't it interesting that they had to clear a whole bunch of red tape just to get it out as fast as they did? The main problem was the red tape.
Yeah. We just have to ignore all our regulations and procedures so we can get this drug through to save, millions of lives.
Well, see, if I have cancer, an experimental drug, the risks of an experimental drug might not, I may have a very different risk calculation than someone else does. And it's up to me and my doctor, right, to decide whether we want to take an experimental drug that might be dangerous. And if the drug company says they'll only sell it to me and my doctor if I sign the waiver, then what they're doing with eliminating these waivers is preventing sick people from making their own health decisions.
Exactly.
Maybe saving I mean, you think of beta blockers that were, finally approved, heart medicine finally approved. In the meantime, while the FDA is dragging its feet to approve this important heart medicine that has extended the lives of tens of thousands of people, people died. People were getting the widowmaker heart attacks and dying in the thousands.
Yeah, and the research shows that the FDA causes far more harm than it prevents. I mean, in terms of killing people killed or people harmed because drugs are kept off the market. I mean, many drugs just aren't developed. It's so expensive. Right. It takes so many years that the pharmaceutical companies, they just look at the cost and say, no, there's no way.
A monopolistic barrier to entry to have this huge approval process that costs millions upon millions of dollars and years to get through. The ordinary guy starting a pharmaceutical company simply can't compete. It's the regulations in every case create a coercive monopoly situation, don't they?
It prevents much more competition from taking place. With regard to flu epidemics, I think it was the flu in the late 50s, before the FDA had as much power as it does today. Then it had safety, this power to regulate safety, but not efficacy for drugs. That came in 1962. And a vaccine for, I think it was called the bird flu at the time, in the late 50s, they developed a vaccine in 2 to 3 months. It was on the market, 2 to 3 months after the epidemic started. So if we could have had, because the vaccine was created in January of 2020, before the first case even showed up.
The technology was already there.
So 2 to 3 months later, it would have put that in February, March, or April. Instead of
the lives that might have been saved, or at least the hospitalizations might have been reduced.
The tremendous reductions, I think. And people, they have to make good decisions. And if they don't understand, they have to find an expert that they trust. But that's just a part of the nature of dealing with products in a free society. They're wonderful, but they're complex. And you have to take responsibility for figuring out, what the effects of those products are, side effects, or whatever it might be, and dangers. And if you can't understand it on your own, you need to turn to an expert that you can trust.
Well, and the thing is that I'm much more likely to trust the good housekeeping seal of approval for popular mechanics and their ratings than I am a government regulator, frankly. Government regulators are subject to politics. They're subject to corruption. In a way where the good housekeeping seal of approval, right? Or the
Underwriters Laboratories.
I was just about to say Underwriters UL. I trust those kind of people to give me advice on safety and effectiveness of products far more than I do what my friends call the Federal Death Administration, for example.
Right. Well, third-party evaluators like the Consumers Union and Underwriters Laboratories, their reputation is built on making sure they have objective evaluations, and they're just not given a huge budget with lots of power like regulatory bodies are. And of course, those regulatory bodies, there's a whole host of research that shows, from the public choice perspective, that shows that often these regulatory bodies are captured by the entities that they're supposed to be regulating, and so there's sort of that corruption that you're talking about. That's a part of it, where they're not really even providing, from the standpoint of a government regulator, an appropriate evaluation. So I'd much rather trust a third-party evaluator because I can judge them on my own. I can judge the opinion they provide or the research they provide on my own, and I determine whether that's useful.
I decide my level of risk. My safety is actually my responsibility when I buy stuff. Right.
It's a novel concept, huh?
Novel concept. I get to determine my level of risk. Curious.
Right. I've actually written quite a bit on that in a previous book I wrote called Markets Don't Fail, on the regulation of safety. Products.
I have fully read. I have to admit, that's the book I have read of yours. It is an outstanding book that addresses really both in a theoretical and concrete way this alleged attack on, quote, market failures and externalities and stuff like that. That's a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it. And I can't end this conversation without urging people. What I'm going to do now is read the book and urging people to go buy your book and check it out and read it. What a fascinating conversation, Professor Simpson. I hope you'll join us again for more of these conversations.
I'd be glad to, and thank you for having me.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us today. And as I say, if you find this content valuable, please do consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. We're doing some of the most exciting work out there. We're creating an international community of students of objectivism and the free market and individualism in a way that got to be one of the most exciting things happening in the world today. And if you agree, please hit like, share, subscribe, comment, and really think about joining. Hit that join button, which we have now. But for now, I will say take care and have a great week.
If I can just jump in a bit, I'd like to thank Mary-Ellen and Christopher for the super chats. And also Christopher had a question. So maybe if we have a quick answer about Professor Simpson broader work, if you have any short thing to say.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I've written that book, Markets Don't Fail. That was my first book that I published. I've also written a book, 2-volume book. It's the publisher actually wanted me to create 2 books out of it. It's called Money, Banking, and the Business Cycle, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 focuses on integrating theory and practice, explaining the business cycle using Austrian business cycle theory and some of my own additions to that theory. And then Volume 2 is remedies and alternative theory. So what to do to solve the problem of the business cycle and refuting other theories of the business cycle. And lastly, I'll say I'm working on a book for a long-term perspective on the foundations of economics, which, will include some philosophical issues obviously related to that.
All I can say is, wow. Wow. You're doing some very important work and crucial issues. So all I can do again is urge people to check your work out. Please do check his work out about market failure and the new book about constitutional reforms. Thank you so much, Professor Simpson, for joining us. As I say, have a great weekend, everyone.
We have one more super chat from
Robert. They keep coming in.
He says, thank you for the valuable discussion. Amy and I are looking forward to talking to James in 90 minutes on today's Speak of Friday. And yes, that's happening at 8 p.m. UK time. James Valliant, Robert Nasser, and Amy Nasser will continue their discussion on keeping it real. And today it's about insights on Atlas.
That's right. We'll be talking Atlas Shrugged. Some of the questions from Dr. Peikoff's the Keeping It Real collection, but bring your own questions about Atlas Shrugged. If you have something, we're not Leonard Peikoff. We'll have to qualify most of what we say, but bring your own questions. Let's have a discussion about Atlas Shrugged today. Then it's just in a couple hours. Take care.